In October 2020, Venice stayed dry for the first time during a major flood in over 1,000 years. 78 steel barriers rose from the seafloor and held back the tide. Italy called it a miracle. It took 16 years longer than planned and cost over $6 billion, more than triple the original estimate. The mayor of Venice was arrested over it. And barely a year after it switched on, inspectors found the gates corroding underwater, coated in barnacles, their hinges rusting. The system that's supposed to save Venice from the sea needs constant rescuing from the same sea. Stand in St. Mark's Square on a high tide afternoon and look down at the stones. They're dry. A year earlier, in November 2019, the same square sat under almost a foot of murky lagoon water. Shops destroyed, the basilica invaded, gondolas tied to lampposts. Now, when the Adriatic surges, a siren goes off. A control room makes a call, and somewhere out beyond the lagoon, at the 3 inlets where the sea meets Venice, 78 enormous yellow steel barriers tilt up from the seafloor and lock the city in. The water hits them. Venice keeps its feet. Everyone calls this a miracle. And in 2024 alone, those barriers were raised more than 30 times, by some estimates preventing 200 to 400 million euros in damage every year. That is what success looks like. Now look at the same system from underwater. According to reporting from people who watched this project closely, inspections after the first activations found something almost embarrassing in its plainness. Barnacles, mussels, crabs, marine growth caking onto the joints and hinges of barriers that are supposed to be precision machinery. Corrosion specifically reported on the hinges. A proposed temporary fix to clean and treat them, reportedly costing around 14 million euros, was not approved. So the gates were left in the water, doing what steel does in salt water when you wait. That is the contradiction this whole story sits on. The barrier that saves Venice from the sea is being slowly destroyed by the same sea every hour, every day, whether it's raised or not. The miracle and the maintenance bill are the same object. You can hear the trap forming in the numbers. Construction began in 2003. The last barrier wasn't laid until 2019. As of late 2025, the project is still not formally complete. The cost, originally pitched as something in the low billions, climbed past 5.6 billion euros to over $6 billion, more than triple the original estimate. And depending on the source, you'll see figures ranging from around 6 to 7 billion euros and beyond. Even the bill is a moving target. And underneath all of that, there is a separate ongoing number that nobody fully wants to commit to. How much it costs to keep this thing alive every single year, forever. Estimates for ongoing maintenance vary widely. Cleaning and upkeep of the gates has been put at around 63 million euros a year. Other figures fold in larger multi-year allocations of 100 million, nearly 200 million across 3 years. The point is not which number is right. The point is that nobody agrees. The figure keeps drifting, and some observers have openly questioned whether money at that scale can even be physically spent on this thing every year without leakage. That uncertainty is the design flaw nobody wants to put a sign on. You do not need an engineering degree to see why Venice felt it had no choice. The lagoon is mostly less than a meter deep. The city is mostly less than a meter above the water. The whole arrangement only works because of the angles between wind, tide, and low ground. And once those go wrong, you get aqua alta, high water, flooding St. Mark's, drowning ground floors, soaking centuries-old wooden foundations. Venetians have lived with that for over 1,000 years. By the late 20th century, with subsidence, rising seas, and worse storms, the negotiation between the city and the lagoon was losing. The plan was bold: walk a steel wall across the 3 openings of the lagoon. Keep it hidden underwater when conditions are normal. The lagoon needs to breathe, ships need to sail, tourists need their canals. When a dangerous tide is forecast, pump air into the hollow gates and let them tilt up to the surface, becoming a barrier 90 meters long across each inlet. The body responsible for designing, building and maintaining the project, the Consorzio Venezia Nuova, was founded in 1983. The first major construction did not begin until 2003, 20 years between the plan and the first pour. That is the first time the system blinked. Then the deadline started moving, original completion in 2011, pushed to 2018, then 2021, then 2025. And as of November 2025, the project is still not formally complete. Every deadline became the next deadline. Anyone reading the news long enough started to suspect the answer to "when will Mosè be finished" was a verb tense, not a year. You can choose to read that as Italian bureaucracy or as something else. The other thing it was, factually, was a system that hadn't even started working yet, while marine engineers, contractors, and politicians were already cycling through it for over a generation. In June 2014, that long arc finally produced its scandal. Venice's mayor at the time, Giorgio Orsoni, was arrested along with 35 other people in a sweeping corruption investigation. According to reporting, around $27 million in public funds tied to Mosè construction had been embezzled. The former head of the consortium responsible for building the barriers had already been arrested the previous year. He admitted providing illegal cash to fund Orsoni's election campaign. The illicit fund was built, prosecutors said, through systematic overbilling, sometimes for services that simply did not exist. This wasn't a sideline. The exact body in charge of building and maintaining the barriers had, for years, been running a kickback operation inside the project. The same money meant to ensure that these gates would actually work when raised against an angry Adriatic was being skimmed and routed offshore. Costs climbed past 5.6 billion euros even before the scandal had fully unfolded. The Italian national government later disbanded the entire Venice Water Authority, the body that was supposed to be watching the consortium, principally because 2 of its former presidents had been accused of accepting bribes from the same consortium. So now read the cost overruns again. Triple the original estimate. 16 years late, you cannot separate those numbers from the fact that the people managing the money were, in part, stealing some of it. Every line item on this project from that point forward sits next to a court file. For a while, it looked like the verdict was going to be a familiar one. Another European mega-project, dragged through corruption, blown past every reasonable deadline, becoming a polite word for embarrassment. And then, on 3rd October 2020, with the Adriatic rising beyond 1.5 meters outside the lagoon, every gate was raised for the first time in a full operational test against an actual flood. Inside Venice, the alleyways stayed dry. That is the most dangerous moment in this whole story, because it is the moment where it becomes very tempting to declare victory. The system worked. It kept working. By the most cited count, the barriers have since been raised around 25 times a year on average, with more than 30 raisings in 2024. Each event protects shops, basilicas, homes. Each event prevents flooding that. before Mose would have cost the city tens or hundreds of millions in damage. By that measure, this is one of the most successful pieces of public infrastructure in modern Italian history. You might assume that's the end of the trap. The corruption was the trap. The delays were the trap. They built the thing, it worked, you can roll the credits. That's not the story, because the system was always going to have a second life. The part that runs not for hours during a storm, but for decades between storms. And that's where the design assumption underneath this whole thing starts cracking open. Mose was conceived to spend most of its time invisible. Most days the gates are flat on the seabed, full of water, hidden, waiting. They're surrounded by salt water, mud, marine life, mussels, barnacles, crabs. The hinges that allow each one to swing up to the surface are sitting in the most aggressive industrial environment you can imagine. Not for a few months, but for years on end. Steel in salt water is not a neutral object. It rusts, it pits, it loses tolerances, it picks up biology. So according to local reporting, when inspectors looked at the gates after they began operating, they found exactly that. Encrustation, marine growth on parts that need to move with millimeter precision. Corrosion on hinges that are the entire mechanism. A proposed temporary fix to clean and treat the gates, costing around 14 million euros, was not approved. The gates kept sitting in the water, the biology kept building up, the corrosion kept going. This is the reversal that changes the shape of the whole story. The barriers don't fail when they're raised against a major flood. They've shown repeatedly that they can do that. They're failing slowly, continuously. Every single day they sit underwater waiting to be needed. The enemy isn't one dramatic storm. The enemy is ordinary salty water, doing what salty water does to industrial steel every hour, indefinitely. And there is no exit from that fight. You cannot move the barriers. You cannot freshen up the lagoon. The job is the job forever. That is the late trap, and it is brutal once you lay it out cleanly. Sea levels are rising. The Mediterranean is warming. Storm patterns over the Adriatic are not settling down. MIT engineering experts have already warned that the frequency of raisings is likely to increase as the sea rises. The system has been activated around 25 times a year so far. That number is, by every credible projection, going up. Now look at what each raising actually costs. The figure you find most often is around $300,000 per activation. Multiply that by 30 events a year, then by every year going forward, with the maintenance bill on top, and you start to see why the math behind Mose is not a one-time invoice. It's a subscription. The city of Venice, and beyond it, the Italian state, has effectively signed up for an open-ended financial obligation to fight the Adriatic, gate by gate, year after year. Then look at the ecological cost. Every time the barriers sealed the lagoon off, the natural water exchange between the Adriatic and the lagoon stops. Sediment builds up. Organic matter accumulates. Marine biologists have warned for years that frequent closures choke the lagoon's fragile ecosystem, the same ecosystem the city was originally trying to protect. The more often you raise the gates to save Venice, the more often you cut off the breathing of the system that Venice sits inside. So this is the trap in its full shape. Raise the gates more often as the sea inevitably rises. And you accelerate wear, accelerate corrosion, accelerate maintenance costs, and slowly suffocate the lagoon. Raise them less, and you start gambling with the next Aqua Alta, the next 2019. The next time the basilica fills with seawater, pay for the maintenance properly, on schedule, every year, and you're committing Italy to a multi-decade financial pipeline on a project that already cost triple its original budget and sent officials to prison. Stop paying, even briefly, and the corrosion already documented on the hinges does not pause. It keeps going, underwater, where the public does not see it. Every option leads to another bill. Every fix leads to another fight. You can already see the shape of the workaround. Venice now markets Mosè internationally as a global model, studied as one of the most ambitious coastal defense systems on the planet, with more than 30 successful activations in a single year, preventing 200 to 400 million euros of annual damage. At the same time, the city has continued installing supplementary measures. Temporary glass barriers ring the base of St. Mark's Basilica, a 900-year-old building. The spiritual heart of the city is now protected by a 21st century flood system that is itself not declared finished, still battling corrosion and operating under a maintenance budget whose long-term sufficiency nobody can confidently guarantee. That is what hedging looks like. A flood barrier famous enough to be a global case study, backed up by glass panels around the church, because nobody is fully confident that the big system alone is the complete answer. Both are real. Both are needed. Both signal that even the people running this consider Mosè a fight, not a solution. There is one more thing that has to be said cleanly. None of this is an argument that the project should not have been built. The water needed to be stopped. The 2019 flood is the kind of disaster nobody wanted to repeat. The 2020 activation, the first real one, was a genuine engineering achievement, even with everything else stacked behind it. That part is true. The story isn't they built a bad thing. The story is they built a real thing on terms they did not fully reckon with. Because here is the calmest, hardest version of the case against Mosè as currently funded and maintained. This is a system whose original sin is not corruption, although there was plenty of that, and not delay, although there was plenty of that too. The original sin is that it was designed to live submerged in salt water for decades, while the planning, funding, and political structure underneath it was built for a clear endpoint. They imagined an opening day. They imagined a finish line. They imagined cutting a ribbon and walking off. The barriers do not allow that. The barriers are a relationship. That is what the corrosion is telling you. Not that the engineering failed. It didn't when tested. The corrosion is telling you that the assumption underneath the engineering, the political assumption that there would be a moment called done, is the part the steel doesn't agree with. Walk past the Doge's palace at the end of a high tide afternoon. The square is dry, the shops are open, the basilica is intact. Somewhere out at the inlet, 78 gates are settling back down to the seabed for the next wait. Barnacles are already growing on the hinges. Salt water is finding its way into joints engineered to resist it. Sea level is up another fraction this year. Somewhere in a Rome ministry, a line in a budget spreadsheet is being argued about by people who will have to defend that number every 12 months. Italy did not build a wall against the sea. It married it. The wedding cost over $6 billion, took 16 years longer than promised, and produced 36 arrests, including the city's mayor. The marriage is now permanent. The bills arrive every year. The water never stops asking. And the part that is breaking down isn't really the steel. It's the idea that any project of this kind ever ends.